Hello, my friends. Good morning. Welcome back to PB Reads the Bible, another episode of PB Reads the Bible. I'm Brian. I'm Pastor Brian. That's hence the PB. And we have returned from our hiatus, our hiatus, using TV terms since we're doing videos here. And this is episode 24 on our journey through Romans. I have no idea how many episodes total we've done as we've gone through a few books of the Bible, but here we are in episode 24 on our journey through Romans, and that means we will be doing the first half, more or less, almost 2/3 of chapter 12. Chapter 12. And you might say, well, Pastor Brian, chapter 12 isn't all that long. If you're doing 2/3, might as well do the whole thing. Well, just because it's not long doesn't mean there's not a lot there. I've said it before, Paul says a lot without saying a lot sometimes. We could almost do a session just on the first 2 verses of chapter 12, I think, but we're not going to do that. But good morning and welcome back. Welcome back to me, I guess, too. It has been nice. Good morning from Archibald, the rest of the week from Chelsea, Michigan. You're back on your way out there, huh, Marcia? Good to see you. Good morning, Maureen. Good morning. Good morning. Heard from one of our usual suspects that they'll be joining us later. They got something going on at 9 o'clock. Totally understand that. But a week off hasn't made you forget anything. I see people checking in. That's what I was going to say next was go ahead and check in. Use the comment section to say hello, good morning, whatever. You can also use that to ask questions or make comments. And I'll try to stay up on that. So when you see me looking to the side, I'm looking at Facebook to see what you're saying. Don't always see those things right away. Sometimes Facebook doesn't show me until later, but I do go back in just to check to make sure if anybody's asking a question that I need to address. Well, I mean, I need to address all questions, but some of them just go personal and some are to everyone. Good morning, Cheryl. Good to see you this morning as well. Can also use my cell phone, 570-351-1619. And as I say that, my phone vibrates. From Ron, good morning. A lot of rain up here, a lot of flooding around the valley. Keep the whole northeastern states in prayers. You are correct, Ron. Henri hit the New England states pretty substantially and hit upper PA substantially. One of my cousins posted a picture of her rain gauge and it was it was at 5 inches, getting ready to overflow by the look of it. So prayers for everyone throughout that whole area, for sure, affected by that. I had a good week off. It was good to have the week off. Good morning, Marilyn. Good to see you. Yeah, so we're ready to go. Back here, episode 24. So it's the first part of chapter 12. That's what we're going to dig into now. And I'm probably going to pause almost right off the bat. I'm going to read a few words, I think. Chapter 12, verse 1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Pause. We're going to pause there. I appeal to you, therefore. And appeal to you is pretty good a pretty good translation. The NIV says urge you, also a pretty good translation. Some translations say I beg you. Probably not a really good translation. Paul is not just saying please. This is a very strong Greek word that he uses. It's a very strong Greek context. Good morning, Joe. That Paul uses to start this off. And I appeal to you is pretty good. I appeal to you. I urge you. Not I beg you, because I beg you sounds almost like dropping on your knees. Oh, please do me this favor. And that's not what Paul is saying for sure. But he's really strongly exhorting, encouraging people. You've got to do this. I appeal to you. I urge you. Therefore. Therefore is one of those connecting words, right? So, try to remember everything that was taking place right before this. I plead in my translation. Plead isn't too bad, although it does have almost that beg kind of idea. All right. So it's he's not he's not pleading like almost in a negotiation kind of thing. It's stronger. Plead isn't bad, but it could be a little stronger to what Paul is saying there. But the other key part there is that therefore. The NIV actually starts with the word therefore. Therefore, I urge you. And the NRSV does, I appeal to you, therefore, which connects back to everything that Paul just finished saying, right? Because of all of this, I appeal to you, I urge you, I plead with you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Pause. Again, Paul puts a lot in there, and there's a lot of things that we need to kind of understand because of the context. Remembering who Paul is and the time in which he is writing. He is writing in that first century. He's a first century Jew dealing with Second Temple worship. Okay, dealing with Second Temple worship. He has spoken about the mercies of God before, so that's all in there, and which means a whole lot of stuff to Paul. But the more important part here, I think, is this idea of living sacrifice and spiritual worship and stuff like that. Because what Paul is hinting at the cultic practices of that Second Temple in Jerusalem, and the idea, which did include animal sacrifice. Now, Paul is not saying animal sacrifice. He's not saying we need to continue that. He's saying to offer ourselves as that living sacrifice. He is not calling for us to, kill ourselves on an altar, but that we bodily, physically, are taking the place of the animals in how we live, and in how we worship, in how we live and how we worship, and that becomes the, I hate to use the word replacement sacrifice because it's not exactly what Paul was saying. Jesus was the ultimate replacement sacrifice. But rather than, we don't have to sacrifice animals anymore, so we need to sacrifice ourselves, our very being, our living, connecting back to what he was saying about you no longer live in sin or death, you live in Christ. And so by living in Christ, you are offering this living sacrifice. You're putting yourself to death because you're living in Christ instead, which may involve which does involve sacrifice, and may involve suffering. Holy and acceptable to God. And that idea of holy, again, that has a whole lot of undertones. It's a very, very fully packed word. It's a dense word, holy, and gives echoes back to Exodus and to the wandering in the desert and all that, when things were made holy, as in set aside for God, and purified to be made worthy of meeting with God and being with God in the temple, or in the tabernacle at that time, which is your spiritual worship. Is how it is translated in both the NIV and the NRSV. However, if you're using either, and if you're using something else, it might say something else, which is cool if it does, because there's a footnote in both the NIV and the NRSV that says reasonable rather than spiritual. And N.T. Wright points out that perhaps a better understanding, a better translation of it, is Where am I at? That is worthy of thinking beings. So a worship that is worthy of thinking beings. Rather than, and he makes the connection to Revelation, rather than the beasts who worship in a different way, completely unreflectively, without thought, without reason, but that our worship as living sacrifices should have that reason and thought put into it, and understanding. In other words, using the faculties that God has given us in that way. Okay, verse 2. Told you there's a lot just in the first couple of verses. Verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Pause. And the Greek can be tricky to translate. I think I've said that before, and here's another one of those times and places. I've used this passage in the past, and I'm sure others have as well, thinking that Paul is talking about, the world outside, the secular world versus the type of lives that we're supposed to live, and don't conform yourself to the world. But the Greek, rather than world, can also be translated as age. And that probably fits better with what Paul's been saying all along. And especially what he was saying early, if you remember our conversation about that Paul thought of, based on that, again, that first century second temple worship and theology was that we were in one age, but the second age is when the Messiah comes and eventually makes all things perfect. And so do not conform yourself to this present age, where we need to be living into that future age, the perfect age. We might almost say the second coming of Christ, or after that. Live as if that's already taken place, perhaps, is what Paul is kind of taking. And so, in so doing, be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And again, the Greek can be also translated, what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Okay. And does that make sense? The difference between those two, to discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect, sounds like it's describing the things you're looking for, or the deeds or acts, whereas the second way of translating it are actually modifiers of the will of God. They're adjectives describing what the will of God is, which is acceptable, good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Both can be correct, and both are acceptable translations of the Greek. Which one was Paul meaning? We don't know for sure. Quite possibly the second, that we're supposed to be looking for the good and acceptable and perfect will of God in everything we do, and in how we think. And this is all tied into worship. Paul wants the worship to not just be physical, but to also be thoughtful and reasonable and in the mind. But Paul also doesn't want it to only be in the mind and reasonable. He also wants worship to be physical, in offering ourselves as that living sacrifice, as a living sacrifice. Okay, continuing, verse 3. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. It's interesting. Oh, and there should be there's a 4. For by the grace Remember, it's all connected. For is that one of those connecting words. And so this connects back to all of that. Thus belongs with the whole sequence of thought, right? The for, this belongs to the whole sequence of thought. Everything is connected. The grace given to me makes it, Paul makes it because God has equipped him for a particular task. God has equipped Paul for a particular task and has included us as well. The language that Paul uses there is, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. It is interesting, and it's, N.T. Wright just says it's hard to capture in English because of that repetitive use of the word. He says perhaps a better way to translate it: do not overthink above what you ought to think, but think in wise thinking ways. To me, that makes it even more confusing when you think of it that way. It does sound somewhat circular. Paul is describing a certain amount of humility, but it's not a fake humility, or he's not saying make sure you're humble. That's not exactly what Paul is saying. He's and we know that because of what he's going into next. This section of this chapter, although connected to everything else, just like that 4 says, it is about unity within among believers, and this connection into this new family made up of what we've said it so many times before, right? Jew and Greek, Jew and Gentile, however you want to say it, coming together in this family. And so it is still connected. It's, which is something he said before, that the Jews weren't humble. They thought too much of themselves. Well, we're Jews, we're the children of Abraham. But then he also said that about the Gentiles who were grafted in. Don't get haughty about it, because just because you've been grafted in doesn't mean that you can't be cut off. It doesn't mean that branches that have been cut off can't be grafted back in, because God can make that happen. So now that we're still part of this family and this tree, don't overthink about yourself. Don't overthink about yourself. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. So what Paul is saying a couple different things. He is talking about that humility, but a real humility, but mostly as that can impact your relationship with the other. He wants people to think of the other. He wants to think of the other, and if you're doing so much overthinking of yourself, you're not doing enough thinking of the other. So you're not going to have this unity in the body that we're talking about, and that is what Paul goes into. He doesn't use exactly the same language that he uses elsewhere, but he uses very similar language, and perhaps just not as much of it. In Corinthians, he is much more specific with members of the body parts working together. And Paul kind of only hints at it here, but that is what he's talking about. So when he says, don't think of yourself more than you ought to, it's not exactly being humble. I mean, that's part of it, but it's really thinking of the other, and it's also related to your spiritual gifts. We don't know how much Paul knew about the church in Rome, so he may have been addressing some particular concerns, but it's more likely that he was doing general concerns that he thought they might be experiencing because other churches had experienced similar things. That might also explain why he doesn't go into quite a full list of the spiritual gifts. Paul speaks about spiritual gifts in several different locations. Here in Romans, he goes through the list in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, and I can't remember where else he does it. It might be Galatians. None of the lists are perfect matches. None of the lists are identical. There are some that are listed in one that do not appear in the others, or at least only in one, and all that kind of stuff. There are overlaps. There are overlaps between the three, but they're not a perfect match to them. Paul does skip some that might be considered important, and that he writes substantially about in other places. So we shouldn't say that, oh, Paul doesn't think those are important. That's not the case. We don't know for sure why Paul mentions some and doesn't mention others. It could be that he is speaking about the ordinary spiritual gifts rather than the extraordinary spiritual gifts. That's a possibility. So anyway, so think of yourself with sober judgment. Don't overthink yourself, and don't think that your spiritual gifts are that much better than anybody else's. That's part of what's taking place here in what he's saying. That was a big issue for Paul with the church in Corinth. So he might be trying to head off any issues with that here. And he does say, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Now, I'm going to say we can misunderstand that as saying that Paul is suggesting or saying that each person has a different amount of faith. But Paul never says that elsewhere. Throughout this entire letter, he does not say that it's possible for a person to have more faith or less faith. He only talks about a person having faith. Having faith. And what is that faith? That faith is, well, it's obedience, and it's belief that Jesus is Lord, being able to confess that Jesus is Lord, and belief that God the Father raised him from the dead. And that for Paul is faith, along with obedience. Yes, along with the obedience and the trusting in God's promises. That's connected together in that faith. And he seems to indicate throughout the whole thing that faith is faith, regardless of the person. But here it almost sounds, in our English translation, it sounds like Paul is saying that you might have less faith than I have, or I might have less faith than you have. And according to how much faith you have is going to affect your abilities, your spiritual gifts, and judge yourself by your amount of faith. N.T. Wright suggests that that's not what Paul is saying, but that Paul is saying that faith is sort of the standard that we need to measure ourselves by. Okay, whether or not we have faith, and that if I have faith and you have faith, we judge ourselves accordingly. And it's not how much or how little, because we all have faith. And we should remember too, that faith is truly a gift of grace. It is offered to all, but only those who accept it have it. Okay, continuing. Here we get into that analogy. For as in one body, we have many members, and not all the members have the same function. Pause. Now, our 21st century ears, hear members, when we hear it right next to the idea of the body, we might think of body members, but the further you get away from the word body, the less likely we are to remember that that's what Paul is talking about. We might think of just membership, in a club, in a group, in the church. So some translations, rather than using members, use the word parts. And that's probably a good idea. So I think I'm going to change it from members to parts as I read this. I'm going to try to do that anyway. For as in one body we have many parts, and not all the parts have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ. And individually we are parts one of another. Pause. Okay. I kind of like that. I kind of like changing it from members to parts. That it does seem more real. Because for me, parts are pieces that we assemble and put together. And it does take all of the pieces, all of the parts, whether it's a jigsaw puzzle or a model of some form. They all have to go together in order for the whole to work and to be complete. And yes, the body needs all of our different parts, pieces. We can function without certain body parts, but let's not overthink the analogy. When you push a metaphor, it falls apart. So let's not push the metaphor too far. We understand what Paul is saying. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function. So we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually we are parts one of another. I said members a couple times just because I was trying to read it quickly, I guess. And individually we are parts one of another. Now, in other places, especially in Corinthians, Paul dwells in that metaphor of the this body and the parts of the body much longer than he does here. So maybe for whatever reason he doesn't think he needs to go into as much detail here. He's laid the base, he's laid the foundation. He thinks he's said it enough that people can understand what he's talking about. In Corinthians, of course, we see that, when he goes into that more depth, he says one part of the body can't say to the other, I don't need you. One part of the body can't say to the other, oh, I'm more important than you are. And so we are members together, we are parts together in the body of Christ, and we are parts one of another. Almost like, well, not almost like, meaning that I need to rely on you and you need to rely on me, because we are that connected. We are that connected. We are parts of one another. You might hear that saying, oh, he completes me or she completes me. That's almost what Paul seems to be saying here, that by myself, I'm almost incomplete. I need to be connected with you. And so don't think of me, I shouldn't think of myself so much, because then I'm separating myself from you. I'm disconnecting from you, and I'm no longer part of you and you of me. Continuing, we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Pause. According to the grace given to us, it's not the amount of grace, it's kind of, now, our language fails when it comes to describe grace. Excuse me. Our language fails when it comes to describing grace. And I hesitate to use the word, but it's almost like you can't, because grace is grace, but it's as if there are different types of grace. I shouldn't say it that way. There are different movements of grace, And maybe we can say different forms, but I don't even like that one. But God's grace moves within me differently than you, because it's like it's working in cooperation within me and within you. And as a result, we have the same amount of grace because we don't control it. God controls it. We can control perhaps how much we're willing to receive it, but we cannot turn the tap on and off. But God's grace moves me differently than it moves you. And as a result, we have different spiritual gifts. Continue. So that's what Paul's saying. He's not saying that if you have more grace, you're going to get different gifts. No. So starting again on verse 6, we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Prophecy in proportion to faith. Ministry in ministering. The teacher in teaching. The exhorter in exhortation. The giver in generosity. The leader in diligence. The compassionate in cheerfulness. Pause. Now, the NIV translates that a little bit differently, and In Greek, Paul is almost like using stenography or something. He's almost like he's doing shorthand, right? He skips a couple of those words. So to get a better flow, the NIV actually adds a couple of words, and it's probably a good thing that they do. So I'm going to reread that verse, those two verses or three verses in the NIV, just to get the difference, okay? We have different gifts according to the grace given to us. Again, not in the amount, because we all get the same amount. If a man's gift is prophesying, let him use it in proportion to faith, to his faith. Now, the NIV does have a nice footnote, in agreement with the faith. Okay, so not in proportion to his faith, but in agreement with faith. If it is serving, let him serve. If it is teaching, let him teach. If it is encouraging, let him encourage. If it is contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it is leadership, let him govern diligently. If it is showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. Pause. So that actually provides a better flow for the spoken word, and it does kind of fill things in better. Paul was being very abrupt for some reason with it. Ministry and ministering, prophecy in proportion to faith, in agreement with faith. Teacher and teaching, exhorter and exhortation, giver and generosity, leader and diligence, compassion and cheerfulness. He's very abrupt, very brief. So why? I don't know. Trying to save ink. But what he was saying is, use your gifts. Whatever your gift is, use it, and use it for the other is packed into there as well. Especially as the NIV translates that idea of generosity. Let him give, but if it is contributing to the needs of others, that idea of charity, the idea of giving to someone. So he's saying you've got spiritual gifts. We've all got spiritual gifts. Use them. Use them. For Paul, this last section, 12 through 16, is, and we shouldn't think that it's not connected to the first half, because it is. Because it is. It is. It's all connected together. But Paul seems to be moving into more of an ethical discussion in these last few chapters, still tied to everything that he has said before. It's like these last 4 or 5 chapters are the therefore. Hence, verse 12, chapter 12 begins with therefore. So this is like all the theological groundwork, but for Paul, ethics and theology are connected very strongly, cannot be separated. And so he doesn't usually discuss them separately. However, it almost seems like he did for this one occasion anyway. And we can see very strongly, that he strongly is discussing ethics and living, putting everything that I've just said into practice, perhaps, is what Paul is doing. And so that's what really is taking place during these last 5 chapters. All right. So because of all this, therefore, use your spiritual gifts for each other to help build up the body. Continuing, let love be genuine. Hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. Pause. End of our passage for today, too. That's where we're going to stop today, is verse 13. So he has mentioned a bunch of the spiritual gifts all together, and now he comes up with what he later says is the greatest spiritual gift. He says that in Corinthians. Love. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. And for Paul, philos and agape are are closely related, almost identical in definition for Paul. In Greek, they mean different things. In Greek, philos is that love of brother. It's brotherly love. So it's affection, but it's not romantic love, but it's sort of concern. And agape is more than just concern; it's care. But for Paul, you can't separate philos and agape. And in order to truly love your neighbor, you must care for them. So Paul says, let your love be genuine. Don't let it just be a show. Don't let it just be through words. We oftentimes theologians say that they put up a fake dichotomy between Paul and James, because James is all about the action, they say, and it's action, it's deeds, it's not about faith. And for Paul, everything is about faith and grace, and nothing's about deeds, and that's false. That's a false dichotomy. James does speak about faith, and what does he say? He says, you're going to know my faith by watching what I do, because I put it into practice, and we all need to put our faith into practice. And Paul is saying the same thing. Does he say a lot about faith and grace? Yes, he does. But deeds, the actions, are connected to it. And we see that right here in those like 4 words. Let love be genuine. Paul doesn't spell it out perhaps as clearly and practically as James does, but he is very much in belief and favor that our faith and our understanding of grace will impact our actions and result in doing good, in loving neighbor with genuine activity. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good, love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Honor is a big thing in first century and before. The miracle of compound interest. My Hebrew Bible, Old Testament Bible instructor in seminary put it that way. She said that the miracle of compound interest was not yet known. So they thought of money as sort of zero sum. If you have more, it means I have less. We can't both have more, but we can both have more honor. And so honor is the currency of the day that everyone goes for. Now we're getting into a time when that's starting to roll back. It's almost like Paul is saying, let's go back to the old ways. Outdo each other with honor. Outdo each other with honor. Bestow honor on each other. So it's like you're building the other person's bank account. You're building the other person's bank account, and show honor to each other. Build them up. Give them more. Give them more. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Serve the Lord. Remember what was Paul's, the first half of Paul's gospel is confess Jesus is Lord. And which means who's not Lord? Caesar. And every time Paul says that, it's a political statement. We can never separate the politics. You can't separate those two thoughts. The only one who was Lord was supposed to be Caesar, and Paul's saying, nope, Jesus is Lord. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. So the contributing to the needs of the saints, Paul is kind of saying about himself and others working for the gospel, and he's also talking about the people back in Jerusalem. He's going to talk about that I think it's towards the closing, that he's heading back to Jerusalem to take back offerings that had been collected on his ministry in Asia, in some of those places in between. And he's on his way to Jerusalem to bring back those offerings for the church, for the saints in Jerusalem. So he's reminding them to do that kind of stuff. It's tied in with that generosity, and extend hospitality to strangers. Paul's not saying something new. That's if you followed along when I did Genesis. What did I say? That was that's the rule of hospitality. That was big throughout the ancient world, especially there in the desert areas and stuff like that. The idea of hospitality to the stranger. And so it's almost like Paul's, everything old is new again, we might say, that kind of thing. Well, thanks. Good to have you back. Oh, thank you. It's good to be back too. It was good to get away, to take that time off. I guess I didn't realize how much I needed to. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. We're going to stop there on 13. We'll pick up tomorrow and finish up chapter 12, verses 14 to 21. So I do pray that this has been beneficial to you, that you learned something or relearned something, that God has spoken to you through something that we've said, something that we've read. And as you go about your day, this day and every day, keep those eyes and ears, physical and spiritual, open to what God is doing in your life and in the lives of those around you. And when you see it, when you hear it, do two things. Say, thank you, Papa, and then tell somebody about it, especially me, because I want to hear it too. Until we meet again, my friends, until we meet again, be blessed.